Good morning. Glad you're all here. Thank you for coming. And I hope you're having a fabulous uWestFest already. I'm Heather Floyd, working at Scania as a senior Umbraco developer. I've been working with Umbraco since 2006. And generally that was when the love affair began, although the first couple of months when I had to learn XSLT were a little bumpy. Fortunately, anybody picking up Umbraco for the first time these days does not have to deal with XSLT. So, round of applause for that. I have here a very old school little sign-up sheet. And the reason I'm going to pass this around is because though this is, has all the content up here, I don't want you to feel like you have to copy the slides. And I actually have a much more detailed notes packet with all the resources that I talk about and even visible views of the code snippets that you could actually use. So if you put your name here, I will email you this in a couple days. So I'll just start passing this around. So a couple things just about this. The first large-scale grid editor project that I worked on was last summer. We had a client that wanted a lot of design flexibility on their pages. They didn't just have like 3 types of design that they wanted. They wanted essentially a full palette of options. They wanted every page on their site to basically be unique looking. And super modern with like full bleeds and fancy stuff, and of course it has to be responsive. And we decided that we were going to approach this via the grid instead of doing anything with like a lot of document types and a lot of templates, which is the traditional way of doing a lot of variety in your page designs. And in terms of this talk, when I mentioned framework, because everyone might be familiar with the grid, but they're saying, what is this framework thing? In terms of framework in this talk, it refers to 3 things that just have to do with the way that I work on projects at Scania. First of all is that we are using strongly typed models for our doc types. And now this has been built in to the version 7.4, but previous to that we were using the external piece models builder by Stefan. But this has all been built into 7.4, so you don't have to install anything extra for models. The second piece is something called the Scanza framework, which we've developed proprietarily in-house, which is predominantly just some extra add-in extension methods, some custom models to handle media items, a whole lot of library functions, just stuff that we've been building up that's just useful to use. So obviously you don't have to use our framework to get the benefits though. And in fact, I think that just a standardized system of development functions as a framework for people. So if you just have the way that you do things and you do it consistently, that you always create your grid editor controls the same way, that's a framework in my opinion. Because it means that going forward, other developers on the team get familiar with the pattern, and even if they've never seen this particular piece of code, they get it. The layout is the same. The functionality works the same. So that's sort of also a framework. So what we're going to cover today, very briefly, an intro to the Umbraco grid, just for anyone who might not be as familiar with it. We're going to do design, planning, and architecture, which is a big part of getting any Umbraco project right in the first place. And customizing like crazy. This is where we have fun with grid widgets and go wild with row options and allow your client to have, completely infinite varieties of page designs. And then just a couple little grid gotchas, which are not serious problems, but just things you need to be aware of if you're going to build a site on a grid, because you're going to want to account for these things. So real quick intro. How many people in the room are developers? Okay, vast majority. And how many of you have used the grid, in one of your projects? Okay, less. How many in the room are not developers? So you're a content editor or a business person, or a couple. Okay. And how many of you guys have been able to use the grid from the back office as a content editor? Not at all. Okay. And how many of you are not at all sure what the heck I'm talking about when I say grid? Okay, good. So we can make our intro very brief then. But this is, kind of a potential view of a grid in back office in case you're curious. Using the grid has some big benefits. one of the main ones is that you have a balance between editor power and designer developer control. So what this means is that when we create a responsive design, code has to be written a certain way. The HTML has to be structured properly. The classes need to be applied in the right manner. If we can allow the clients to have a lot of flexibility in their design, put pictures, in columns, and really have some fun, we still want to be able to manage the output of that. We do not want to let them have a free-for-all. Also, in terms of getting those unique layouts, we don't need to have rich text editor fields for every page that allow the client to just go in and edit the HTML willy-nilly. We don't have to use the drop-down like the CSS styles. We can control all of that via the back end, which is very nice. And it has already a focus on mobile responsive design compatibility. So right out of the box on Bronco 7.4 comes with renderers for the grid control or Bootstrap 3, I think. But other people that like other frameworks for CSS have built out their own. So you can find ones for responsive VP or other popular responsive CSS frameworks, which is nice. Or you can just roll your own, because all these files are completely editable from the developer side of things. So you're not at all locked in to using Bootstrap, but it's there automatically for a lot of people who do like it. Very brief history of the grid. The grid control was actually created originally as a package by Antoine from a Barcelona, Spain agency named Lakoti. And they created it as something that they thought that they needed for their clients and their projects. They built it out, they released videos about it, and everyone in the world just got super excited. So HQ, being the wise folks that they are, they incorporated it directly to the core in version 7.2 with some tweaks and improvements. And then since then, it has gotten a bit of an overhaul. It's been updated for the latest version. So if you're using 7.4 for any sites going forward, you have the very latest and greatest grid control. My small disclaimer for our talk is that we've only started our first 7.4 project this week. So I do not have like a whole lot of comparative, this is what it used to be and this is what it is now. But I'm pretty sure that at least 95% of the stuff that we're going to talk about will still be relevant. So the structure of a grid is it's actually a data type that you put on a document type, just like a rich text editor. But you have control over how that, how that editor displays on the back office and then how it's rendered in front of the page. And you've basically got a nested structure of a layout, which has sections, which has rows, which has columns, and then widgets, which is, actually they're called frequently editor controls, but we always call them widgets because it sounds more fun. So this is sort of the diagram of the structure. So the layout is actually the entire property on your document type. And you can define, multiple sections. And so you can have people have a choice of having, for instance, a full page versus a page with a sidebar. And then you can define inside that row options that have different quantities of columns available. And then the widgets get added to those columns. So planning is really, really important. And having a good architecture. But first of all, to hit briefly on design and specification challenges with the grid. Designers and clients both need to think differently about the grid and how it works. It's not the same as, here's your page layout and we're going to make you a website where it looks exactly like this, except that you can change the words, Designers really need to start thinking about their designs in terms of a grid. They have to think about it in terms of rows and columns rather than, pages in their entirety. And as I like to say, Photoshop is easy, CSS and grid architecture is hard. So the more that you can align your designers with the idea of them designing and thinking in terms of rows and columns, the easier it's going to be when your team has to build the widgets out and the row options, because you can do whatever they come up with, but it's a lot of extra legwork. And sometimes the back editor experience might suffer a little bit if you have to give them tons and tons of extra little config options to make certain variations of the design work. So ideally, you get your designers right on top of this. And the same thing is that the clients need to also be thinking in terms of modularity. So it's not like we have this design and it's like monolithic and this is what it looks like. They have to say, okay, we're going to get like a crayon box, and we can put different pieces all around the design. We could have the rows and we could rearrange the rows. We could have a full width row and then 3 columns, and then we could have another full width. And sometimes it's hard because the clients aren't used to thinking about things with that much flexibility because they're not used to having that kind of power. So this is something that, early on in the project, you need to talk to the clients and get them excited about. It's going to be a huge advantage, and once they get it, then they love it. But sometimes it's a bit of a mental leap for them. Actually, my colleague Heather Alvis is going to talk in the next session, in the other room, a lot more about this portion of the project, thinking about the grid, speccing it out, and dealing with your clients. So, highly recommend it for any of you that are really interested in this topic. So yeah, finally, think in a grid. This is the new rule. The architecture of doing a grid, a highly grid design page is a little different than just a standard Umbraco design. So, grid architecture. Now the rule here is planning because as you start to build out these pieces, you really have to look at how they're going to interact with each other, how the widgets interact with the rows that you're working on, and how rows are going to interact with each other in different combinations. Because of the freedom that editors have, they can make any combination of rows, in any order. So you want to make sure just that things aren't going to start looking crazy. And when you get your design from your designer, as a developer, you're going to want to just kind of like redline it and break it out and say, okay, this looks like this is where a column or a row is going to be breaking in this design. And we realize that this unit is a widget that we're going to have to build out. And these are the properties that this widget's going to need. We're going to need to have a headline, and then a descriptive text, and then an image. But this is going to be a certain unit. And that's sort of where the planning portion comes in. Some tips about architecting your grid. You saw this previously. This is my diagram of how it works. This is, technically how you can set up your grid. However, my recommendation is don't do that. Do not create more than one section in your grid control. The main reason is future-proofing. Because if you define, once this is defined, and an editor goes to a page, and they say, oh, I want the full width page here, or I want the one with the sidebar here, and they make that selection, and then they start putting in rows and columns and widgets and typing content and uploading pictures. If they're like, actually, I think I started with a full page, but I would like to have the sidebar now. You cannot change. You can't just flip it. They will have to delete all of the work they've done and then make the selection of the one with the sidebar and then redo it. It's just, that's the way it works. So don't make the clients unhappy. Don't make them do that. The other thing is design sometimes update and change. Your template might change. You might start with a design that allows people to have a sidebar, and then somebody later on says, you know what, this sidebar thing is so 2010. I think we all want every page to be full width. No more sidebars. Guess what? Now the clients have to go in and change all the page content and start over. If you think you do want a sidebar, then just create a second property on your document type to handle the sidebar. So have 2 grids on your property. The main content, the sidebar content. Because what happens is then you can allow people to select, widgets for a sidebar, and if later you do away with sidebars, you just rip it out of the template. That's it. The content can hang out, it doesn't matter. Or if later you decide that we're going to add sidebars to every page, then all they have to do is go in and pick sidebar bits. They don't have to screw around with their main page content. Because you can combine these 2 things in your template. You can say, render main here, render sidebar here. Boom, done. Don't forget, it's always easier to combine things programmatically than to split them. So just start with it like that. The next thing to talk about is how much of our page is going to be a grid. We've actually done designs where except for like, the footer and the top, header nav bar, the entire page is rendered by a grid control, which gives clients a lot of flexibility and freedom, and they like it. But sometimes you don't need the entire page to be a grid. This is, a homepage design. And the thing is, on this homepage design, there are two slightly complicated elements that are only used on the homepage. They're not used on any other page on this site. The first part is this upper part here. It's sort of like an update of a slider. It's a content, little content boxes with links and things. And this is a little fancy. We've got those little boxes floating over top of the full width one. And this takes a little special handling. And then the other thing we've got down here is this little Twitter feed thing. It's hard to see in the picture, but it's just a little Twitter reader that just shows the latest tweet from their account. And this bottom one doesn't even require any editor interaction. They don't need to be able to update that at all. So it just doesn't make sense to make it a widget. It's just not needed. In terms of the top one, it's a little complicated. So what we did for this is we just put a nested content control on the homepage document type for that area. So these are like little slides that they can edit separately from the grid. And then we have partials that render those two pieces in the homepage template, and we have the grid rendered in between them. So this actually, it keeps our grid a lot cleaner because we don't necessarily want people to be able to pick the Twitter bar on another page and drop it onto their page. Or, or render this crazy content thing on another page. So it's another way to exert a little bit of designer control. The other piece of this is that, if you need to have a widget that could potentially be dropped in the middle of this, if the Twitter bar had to be here, for instance, and this is in the middle of our grid, then my suggestion is just make that piece of it a macro, because a macro can be added to a grid. So you can let people drop in, and we could have even done the top piece as a macro, call it like, fancy homepage thing, and they could have dropped it wherever in the grid. Now, granted, you don't have as much control. You can't say, well, you're not allowed to put this on, the About Us page. But at least, you can control the rendering of that completely that way. And you don't have a super complicated grid control that an editor has to deal with. Here's another one. This one's maybe slightly controversial. Pick the appropriate number of row configuration options. How many sort of choices do you want to allow your clients to have? And this is, once again, it's the same thing as with everything. You have a balance between flexibility and complexity. And this is also going to be based a lot on what your designer comes up with. So, as I was saying before, if your designer is sort of on board about grid, and if you say to them, look, these are the possible sort of choices for rows in our design appropriately. If you don't, if your designer gets to do whatever they want, they have kind of a free-for-all, this might be what you end up with. And this is for real. This is from one of our real projects. We have a really, really flexible design for these people. And so far we haven't gotten complaints, but it is a lot of choices. The disadvantage, of course, is that on a smaller screen, this is what it looks like in the interface. They start to come in and it gets a little confusing looking for the editors. So that's just a little usability thing to keep in mind. If you put too many row configuration choices out there for them, it can just start to look a little overwhelming. Another tip is consolidate your widgets. So these are design variations we had for these little boxes. Some of them it's just a headline with a picture. Some of them it's headline, picture, and it's linkable. And for this last one here, the animated blacklight overlay, it obviously has a different style, and it has this little click effect. So the thing is, you do not want to create 4 separate widgets for this, because they all have the same elements. They all need a headline, a picture, maybe a description, a link. So what we tend to do is we try to look at everything and break them into what would be reasonable widgets based on the data that's required, not the way it's rendered. And what this then allows us to do is just add a single drop-down option on our widget that says layout, style. And then you can put your choices in there. It could be image on the right, image on the left, image on the bottom, image on the top, image on the background. And allow your editors to make that selection, rather than offering them 65 individual widgets, which once again, like the row option, starts to just look overwhelming to some of the users. The other advantage is that if they decide to change, know, like they want to change the button color, you know, or something. Or they're going to take the link off, or they're going to put the link on. They don't have to recreate the content, they just change the style of that widget. They don't have to delete the widget and put in a different widget. So that's also handy for them. So this is the fun part, customizing like crazy. Creating these crazy grid widgets without even having to know Angular. So now you can certainly build your widgets in Angular, and that's a recommended practice. And if you are a JavaScript fiend and you love Angular and you're fantastic at it, go at it. Actually, if you are into that and you're new at it, check out Mark Stuckler's talk from uKFest last year. He had a really good talk about grid, and he talked about how to go about, you know, what pieces you need to build out to create a widget using Angular. But I'll be honest with you, I'm actually a back-end focused developer, and my Angular skills are like about that big. Enough to be mildly dangerous, but not actually accomplish anything. So the other thing is when I was talking about in terms of framework and standardizing your code production, you know, I've created sort of the way that we build widgets, and it's the same way for every widget, and it uses this back-end tool called Blender, which is really pretty awesome. And if you're doing anything with grids, you just have to get it and install it. Blender is awesome even if you plan to hand build all of your widgets in Angular, because of this little back office add-in bit that they give you, which allows you to see all your grid editors in the back office, just like data types or DOM types, which otherwise do not necessarily built in. So the nice thing about it is this is how you would otherwise edit your control, all in a big fat JSON file, which is fine. I mean, it's definitely readable and it's easy to use, but it can get to be a very long file if you've got a lot of widgets or a lot of properties. You know, it's easy to make mistakes. You've got to know data type, GUID, which is like loads of fun. So instead, just install this, use their nice little, like you just click add property, you pick any data type that you want, potentially, from your current install, boom, you're ready to go. And that is one of the biggest advantages of Blender, is that it allows you to use any defined data type in your site as a property on a grid widget. So it gives you as much flexibility as what you used to have, making little sub-nodes, you know, in the content tree for stuff back in the old days. So, yeah, so use any type, data type. Which is also really cool because you can do things like actually add a nested content data type to a grid widget if you really want to go crazy. That's a good thing if you're going to build like sliders or galleries or things that have multiple, you know, kind of zero to many potential pieces. And we've actually built some really cool looking little on-page tab controls, and you know, we can use like a nested content to make the tabs. And then you can do all your rendering via SHTML pages, just like templates. So for all of you Razor developers out there, it'll be very familiar. And yeah, the built-in. They also have a built-in support for one-to-many. So if you're not using something like nested content, but you do want to have like a simple slider or something, you can actually define your thing as just having, you know, headline, text, graphic, and say we want to allow people to pick up to 5 of these, and it will just render it as an iterative sort of thing where people can just click plus plus plus, you know, and add them in. So even if you're not using fancy data types, that's automatically rendered. So, using strongly typed models. If you are using strongly typed models, you want to use, get this little add-ins, the Skywrote Umbraco grid data. And this would allow you to, this is just a simple property. If you've used Models Builder, this might be somewhat familiar to you. If not, don't worry about it. But basically we're just saying, we're going to get our page content, which is a grid control, and we're going to return it as this thing called a grid data model. Boom, done. So grid data model, you know, I won't go into a lot of details on it, but it basically allows you to, you know, do things like grab sections, you know, grab rows, grab columns, grab widgets, so you can, you know, use a for each, you can roll over it, etc. Not that you really need to, because here we are rendering our grid in a template, just using standard, you know, grid renderer files. HTML get typed grid HTML. Here's our property that we just made, and that's the renderer file we want to use. So, If you want to use your custom model inside a widget editor, this is really small. Sign up so you can get my things in case you want to read them. But basically, we created a thing called a media video as a special media type. And what we wanted to do is allow people to pick a video on a widget and then render it a certain way. So we actually go ahead and change it into one of these strongly typed video media objects. And then we can do things like just say, the iframe URL is equal to our media video dot video URL. We can access all of our custom properties directly in the widget rendering, which just makes things more convenient. Cleaner, get IntelliSense, things compile, no magic screens, etc. The other thing you're going to think about is error handling inside your widget rendering, which is something that you might not be thinking about. But the thing is, particularly as you're doing active development, and if you have clients that are entering content and then saying, oh, wouldn't it be really awesome if this thing could also allow us to have a link on it, and you have to go in and add a link field. Your properties can change as you're working on this, and content might already exist that is using those widgets and those properties. And what's going to happen is that if you add a new property to something, and there's a piece of content that has this control already on it, it's not going to know about that new property. And when you try to view the page, if you're calling for the property in your code saying, hey, go grab the link URL, it's going to go, no reference exception, no such thing. And you really don't want stupid yellow screens of death on your grid widgets. So just stick in some error handling. It's just very simple. We have here, var header, try, header, item get the value header. So if this doesn't exist, we're just going to catch it, and we're not going to allow the whole thing to blow up. We're just going to log it, so maybe later someone will go in and fix those. But particularly if it's a property that's sort of optional on some of the renderers that you're using, like in our original example there, description. Maybe we add description later because they want this thing. All of the ones they've already placed on pages don't need a description. It doesn't get rendered. So just allow it to be blank. It's all good. Fail quietly. So, grid on steroids. You have a lot more control than just creating these individual widgets, although you can do a lot with those. But you can actually change the way that the renderer file in total works. So what this means is that you can actually use your renderer file to peek into the grid and say, okay, based on certain conditions of what the people have selected in our grid, do different things. By default, it just kind of loops through. It go through the sections, render each section, render each row, boom, very standard. Render each widget, use the widget file, no problem. But you can actually just take a peek inside and do some tests. You can test for layout or section names. So if they picked this section, then do this special handling. If they, this might be the way you clean up one of those oopsie moments where you created, a sidebar option, and then later you have to kind of take that out. If it says sidebar, render it. You can check for row name options. So if this is a full width row versus a 3-column row or whatever you've named your rows, do different things. And then you can actually peek inside and say which widgets are actually inside there. Which ones specifically, we have special handling based on a certain widget, or how many widgets do we have in that row? Do we need to change the way that it's rendered because of that for some reason? And you can even look at the properties on the widgets themselves. So you can really do a dive, deep dive into that and really control the output pretty intensely. So things that I have customized for our recent projects. Adding the row layout as a CSS class. This is mostly just kind of like a little helpful thing for our front-end developer to plug into. Just say, hey, let's just tell them what row we're on. So if they want to, if they need to do special padding for certain types of, row layouts, then they can do that. So just drop a class on there. Makes them happy. We also have a lot of row options, which is the way that you can handle the portion that happens behind the entire row as opposed to what's, in individual columns. And so this one we needed some of our rows to be able to be a full bleed background image versus, a non-full bleed. And so what we did here is we said basically, get the container class, which is there. We just say, take a peek, and if this particular option, which is called special container on the row, is checked, then just change the class to container fluid instead of plain container for this particular row. This fixed a really sticky design problem we were having. The other thing is, it's pretty basic to be able to put on like a background color or a background image, but we had some options where we wanted people to be able to select both and do a special overlay kind of thing, where you have where your background image actually has a color overlay that's partly transparent. So we have the option, so if they want to pick gray as their background color, but they don't pick an image, cool, that's what you get. If they pick a background image and no color, that's what you get. If you pick both, ooh. But this took an actual extra inserted little div to handle that overlay. So we actually do a check in the code that says basically, if it has both, then render our little div color overlay. Also, at least in the older version, I will not comment on 7.4 in case this has changed, but you could only put one of each type of attribute on a row. So if you wanted to have like multiple options, like we want to allow them to pick the padding for this row, we want to allow them to pick background color for this row, we want to pick an image for this row. And you wanted to make them classes, which is what the CSS front-end people like. You were a little bit out of luck because they were only expecting one unique attribute name for each of those properties. And we couldn't have that. So I said, you know what, as long as we name them uniquely, Rocco's not going to complain. So we have class 1, class 2, class 3, class 25. And then in the rendering code here, basically we just say, let's compile them. Strip off the numbers and then put them all together. If they all are class, then we're just going to put them all in class. Class equals, gray background, row padding medium. So we took care of that. This one was a really fancy thing. Reusable content-filled widgets. So some of our widgets, as you might have seen from the previous design picture, are really complicated. They've got a lot of little doodads. They've got background graphics, they've got icons, they've got text, and it makes kind of this unit of an object. And sometimes I was noticing that the clients might want to use that same chunk, or the exact same content, on multiple pages. How tedious to have to go in and recreate this detailed thing on every page. Plus, what happens if suddenly one of those feature points changes? Now they got to dig through, find every page that used this widget and update it. Because keep in mind, all of your grid content is stored just as a JSON blob on that document type. These are not nodes that are linked necessarily. So I said, well, let's build some nodes that are linked. So we created a different sort of doc type called a reusable content widget. And we got a little folder in the content tree so people can create them. And then I just created a widget that was just essentially a drop-down to pick one of these. So people can actually select one of these reusable widgets instead of recreating a widget from scratch in their layout. And then we just have this special rendering code where we say, if it's this fancy thing, we're not going to use a rendering file. We're actually going to dip into the tree, grab this completely other node, read the grid property off of that, and render that here instead. And so what that does mean is that in that little area where you've got the sort of library of available widgets, if they update one of those widgets, that is the one that's getting rendered on every page. So it will automatically be updated across the whole site. This has a lot more follow-up code, but not a lot. So the little gotchas. Now there are only 2 things that I've noticed so far that are kind of things you just need to be aware of. Other than sort of the general problems of just over-designing it or having sort of UI problems with your editor. One of them is courier. And the latest version of Courier, as of this moment, which will probably change in 3 days, is 2.523. And according to Paul, right now, any standard grid controllers are completely supported by Courier. This is the stuff that comes pre-installed, you know, text string, RTE, whatever. And generally, he said, if you have these highly customized widgets, which you're going to have if you're doing anything serious with this, a lot of them, they're full of just standard things like text boxes, or, you know, media figures. They should work pretty well in the box. But if you're doing fancier things like doing nested content data types or any sort of special data types that you install for packages, non-standard, you might have to build some custom data resolvers to get that data through Courier, particularly if you're doing things that, like, where you're picking widgets from other nodes and things you're going to have to tell Courier. Just so you know, this is a content ID, and we need that translated, you know, when we go across the way. Because otherwise it's just an int, it's just a number. They have no idea what that means. So you might have to spend some time on that. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, it just means you might want to do a little testing, and you're going to want to, you know, get into maybe building some little custom data resolvers for those special things. The other tricky part is examine. So if you're using standard examine on your site, as I said, all of the content is stored in a big JSON blob, which means all your properties are actually stored in there too. You know, it says header dot, you know, hi everybody. So that means if someone were actually, if you were just to say, you know what, cool, page content grid, just throw that in the examine index, no problem. When someone searches for the word header, every single page where you use that widget is going to show up because it has indexed the property names and everything. Not ideal. It also means you can't really dip into that and customize that in any way. However, the workarounds for this is you can customize data that goes into the examine index. There are events that you can tap into, interrupt them essentially, and you could do things like use the Skybread Pro data model and actually do your own custom parsing of grid controls to put things into the index with proper property names and stuff like that. Or you could use full text indexing solution for your site. There is one built in for examine, it's a package. Or like if you're using something like Google Custom Search or something like that, that's going to only be indexing the rendered pages, then obviously this isn't a problem for you. This is if you're doing examine where it's actually indexing the data of the document types themselves. So good news. On Bravo and Courier are improving constantly. So you know, do some testing with your custom stuff and just see if it works. And if it doesn't, then you know there's probably a way to fix that. You can work around it. So in conclusion, you know, generally grid control is a great choice. If you have clients that are demanding a lot of flexibility in their design, they really want it to look modern, they really want to have a lot of control, this is going to be the way you're going to want to go, for sure. If they have more standard templates, like if all they've got is like a home page and a bunch of products and the product pages are all the same layout and you want to have, you know, unique properties for each of those items, then maybe the grid isn't something you really need to worry about. But you know, for really dynamic looking content build sites, it's a fantastic option. Thank you.